just kind of like following that, like the journey that like life can, unveil if we're willing to, to answer it, answer the call to kind of like, meet. And that's available for anybody in like at any point in time. I think but it, can just, it can look different, and the different chapters of life can look very different.
Step into the world of success with your brand amplified, the ultimate podcast designed to unravel the intricacies of thriving businesses. I'm your host, Annika Jackson, and I'm on a mission to uncover the stories, strategies, and secrets that have propelled entrepreneurs and business leaders to success. Even though there have been a lot of stops and starts getting this scheduled with Kyle Maynard, I think it's coming at the perfect time. So we're here. And I am so thrilled to have you here. Not everybody who's listening will know your story. So I'd love for you to share it, but I'll just tee it up by now you're an entrepreneur. You're an extreme athlete. You're a speaker. You're a best-selling New York Times author. You have done so many different things. You've scaled huge mountains, literally and figuratively. So, Kyle, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me. This is great. Yeah. So to share a little bit about my story for some of your audience that's not familiar with my message is kind of a simple one. It's no excuses. And I've gotten now to go and share it around the world, close to 1,000 plus keynote events, mostly like, motivational type conferences and different, leadership events and all that over the years. And it's been amazing. And, it's something where I say though, that like, it's also too, it's like, it's a mountain with no summit. There's no end. There's always excuses. There's always, different limitations and stuff like that we go and place on ourselves at different, points in time. And that's okay. But what I try to encourage people for is to like, look for those things that are within your reach, the things that are within your control, and that you can have a direct impact on in your life. And like some of that low hanging fruit that's there, like some of the most meaningful things to me have been, I think, just hearing people say like, I knew that I had to go and do X, Y, or Z, before I heard you talk. And, sometimes it would be really difficult stuff. Sometimes it's, stuff that people really don't want to deal with, and stuff that people have been dealing with for, a long time. And, to hear that people then after the presentation would, do something different. To me, it's amazing. So to give a little bit of background too, I was born a quad amputee. And, that was like I was born in 86. So the ultrasound technology was a lot different then.
Oh.
And my mom and dad, was the first of 4 kids, and they basically, had normal ultrasound, normal pregnancy, normal first birth until I was born. And they realized that then things were way different than they had expected or anticipated. And it became, a big struggle in different ways. Before I started playing sports, before any of like the media exposure, before any of that stuff, a lot of it was just questioning and, like, just dealing with why did this happen to me? Why was I born different? Like all those different things. And there's so many different amazing people in my life, that have helped me. But one in particular, my grandma, was like everything to me growing up. And I think that she taught me one of the most amazing lessons that I've ever learned just by going to the grocery stores. And so we would go grocery shopping together, and I would be sitting in the front seat of the cart. And most of the time I didn't wear prosthetic arms and legs. And so I was a little kid, 4 or 5 years old, just grocery shopping with grandma, sitting in the front seat of the cart. And people that were just, in the aisles of the grocery store there too, minding their own business, doing their own thing, they kind of inadvertently became our like targets, and we kind of made it like a game where we just go and practice meeting people. Oh. And she would just take the cart and push it up next to somebody. And, she'd introduce herself and she'd say, so hi, my name's Betty. This is my grandson. And I'd reach out and I'd shake their hand. I'd say, hi, my name's Kyle. And she said, as soon as people hear your voice and they see your face and they shake your hand, then the disability will go and fade away. It's not something they'll even think about. And it kind of became true. I always called it like, it was like a Jedi mind trick that like my parents pulled on me, but also, that I was able to inadvertently then pull on other people too. Because it was like there's a saying that where the attention goes, the energy flows. Mm-hmm. And like, I know what you mentioned too, what you're experiencing now, going through some, some like the Zen, training and focus, so much at that, right? Like, where our attention and awareness goes is so much of like what creates our circumstance and experience of life in general. And so, and that's one of the things I just screenshotted the other day, said like, it was, I think it was a Buddha quote where it was like, let anything that disturbs you be your teacher. And it's come up so many times in the last couple of days where I'm just like, like anything that would, be something that would normally kind of, throw me off or like be annoying or, frustrating or whatever. I'm like, okay, well, that's my teacher for right now. But their attitude with that was like to not, so where the attention goes, energy flows. They didn't say that necessarily. I learned that later on, but they, would teach me these types of lessons just through life, and just through living, where they would say, like if you just don't focus so much on the disability, then it won't be that big of a deal. And I've seen that now in so many different people. I think that like have, gone and conquered, enormous challenges in different ways. I think so much of it is mindset for sure, but so much of it too is, what they put their attention and focus and, awareness on. And, if it's not going in that kind of like victim, like, doom and gloom, like mentality, then like, we're able to do so much. Well, but not to say that doesn't happen though too,
Yeah. Well, that's something I was really reflecting on before we jumped on. I know people who, were born with whatever ability or disability or an illness, and they've been put into that victim mentality, and they hold that into their 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s. They can't let go of it, even if they want to, because it's so ingrained in them that they are the victim because their mom took this, fertility drug to get pregnant with them. And then it caused these issues for them their whole life. And they've been handled with kid gloves. And what a disadvantage it is for them to go through life that way. And how beautiful is it that it sounds like your parents are like, you're going to learn how to do all of these things. You're going to learn to be independent. We're going to treat you as a full, whole person, not as somebody who can't.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, even from my perspective now, I think about some of the stuff and the choices that they had to make in different times, and I'm, I was blown away. I mean, they were young parents too. They were in their early 20s when I was born, and so they didn't really have any life experience to go and based off of. But they, I think a lot of what they did was having to just allow me to struggle, and allow me to like go through and fail at stuff over and over again, whether it was getting dressed or like, picking up a spoon, all that stuff, like just, failing at it, and again, to get the visual, right? So my arms in at the elbows and legs at the knees. So when I go and pick up a spoon, I'm literally holding it with my elbows at the end of my arms. And now, when I go and eat dinner or whatever, like on a day to day, like I don't think about it. Like I don't think about the disability even, once, like going through like a typical like meal. But yet, like at the time as a little kid, and it was like, just a ton of failure, just over and over and over and over again. Yeah. And so I had prosthetics that I would use at different times. So for that kind of stuff, I had like a special prosthetic spoon that would go and wrap around the end of my arm, and I'd use that to go and, scoop the food. But then we would leave it at home and, or be at a restaurant or wherever, and like didn't have it with us. And I would be dependent on somebody else. And so my dad saw this, and he said that like, it's basically like he's going to have to figure out how to go and do this on his own. And he was he got interviewed on TV and the HBO, I think Real Sports at one point, where he said, I was going to have to do it on my own or starve. This is the mentality. And so I was like, whoa, I hope he didn't really mean that seriously. But I think that was like their kind of attitude in a nutshell, though, is like just to encourage me to do stuff like I had to go through and, deal with those failures. Other stuff they would go and help with, like, I was close to 15 years old. I think the first time I ever put on a pair of socks, just because it was easier for my mom to go and do it for me. And, and she was the more nurturing type, right? My dad was kind of like, more hardcore with being independent with that. And my mom was kind of more nurturing. And, but just putting on a pair of socks for the first time was like, took 45 minutes, and I was drenched in sweat. The short story with that is like my best friend Joey called me up and wanted to go and take me to a movie, and he had just gotten his lawyer's permit. So it was going to be like him and his mom, and I think maybe dad and siblings and all that. Like they were all going to come and, drive to the car together and come pick me up, and we were going to go to a movie. But my parents were watching my sisters play softball and were away. So I called my mom and told her that, Joe's going to be there in an hour, and I need you to come home and help me get dressed. And normally she would drop whatever to, just come and help. And at that point, she said, I'm sorry, I can't leave, whatever it is I'm doing, watching a tournament game. And she said, you're going to have to figure out how to do it on your own. And so I hung up the phone with her, and I was immediately just like went through all of like the grief cycle, like, frustration and like sadness and like, thinking like, how am I going to go and do this? But I went and found a paper clip in the like drawer where they kept the envelopes and like the mail stuff. And I went and shaped it in my mouth to kind of like the shape of a fishing hook, and went and stuck it in the sock, and I used that to go and pull the sock on for the first time. So 45 minutes later, I had both socks on, but drenched in sweat, and like now I don't use a paper clip or anything like that anymore. You just use the ends of my arms to go and grab the sock, and it, takes maybe, somewhere between, 5 and 20 seconds, depending on the day. But like, it's a relatively simple process compared to what it once was. And I think that's kind of so much of like the messaging in a nutshell is that like, there's one of my favorite all-time business concepts that I've ever learned was by a guy named Bruce Henderson, who was the founder of the Boston Consulting Group, and he called it the experience curve. And basically, if you think about this like experience curve, it applies to everything in our life in different ways. Whatever it is, whether we're learning a new skill, that's foreign to us. Like there's just like front-loaded whenever we start something with a tremendous amount of failure at first, and then we eventually become proficient at it. And then we become, we're able to do it so much more efficiently after that. And so his attitude was in business, if you had a company that made, I don't know, like say like an office chair or something like that, that like they would like, you take these different like parts of the office chair. And what they did was they kind of like would ramp up the production of, whether it was like the wheels on the bottom or like, the spring system and the armrest or whatever. And they'd find different like things that they could produce to go and use those for. And even this is where the idea of like a loss leader kind of came into play. But like even if they made a loss on those different things, as long as they ramped up their production and were able to then subsequently ramp up the experience that they that the crew had making whatever it was that they were making, then all together, kind of the aggregate, like it basically would become much cheaper. And so that's where they're able to go and drive down production costs by ramping up that kind of initial period of of failure. And you can apply that to like, literally any item and see so many different, companies and, different things like that where that shows up and applies. But that was like the birth of the strategic consulting industry. And so, for me, it showed up in, putting on a pair of socks or learning how to go and type or learning how to eat or wrestling, in 35 when I started to then being one of the top wrestlers in my weight class in the nation. But like, just time and time again, it shows up in different kinds of ways. I think it's like one of the most human experiences that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, truly. And the majority of the time you're like, I don't know if you use prosthetics today, but the majority of time it seems like you're not using them because you have become so adept at just knowing your body and knowing how to do everything that a quote normal limbed person would do.
Yeah, no, I tried them a little bit when I was younger, and obviously the technology then was way different than it is now. And I think who knows at some point, in the future, they may be better than, typical arms and legs,
Yeah.
It's like, but I haven't tried them again in a while because it's like I said, I think one of the main reasons is that like, as much as the disability, I think was psychologically, socially, emotionally, especially as a kid, such a difficult thing to deal with and endure. Nowadays, like, on a day to day, it's far from the biggest, that experience. I think it's also too partly due to the fact that like, if you think about like when a brain develops, and somebody goes to like learn how to go and do something, whether it's like, if I'm going to pick up a, pen or pencil or whatever, the way to grab it now, just hold it between the ends of my arms and elbows and use that to go and write. That's the only way I've been able to do it, right? So for you, your brain, or the vast majority of people that are listening to this, probably everybody, but like when people go and grab something, your brain's sending a signal to your hand to go and do it. And so it's, for me, I've only had that like one way. I've only had it, go to like, pick something up with the ends of my elbows. So I've never done it another way. So if I were to use prosthetics or anything like that, I'm literally having to retrain everything.
Yeah.
Rewire everything. So somebody that's like a veteran or something like that, right? Like, that's coming home, and dealing with an injury, their brain's wired, to go in to deal with the limb. And so I think that that's where it's a big difference. For me, it's just kind of, it's the only way that I've ever known, just doing what I've done.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk at this point about mindset. As we were talking earlier, I work with a former Zen monk, and mindset is so important when it comes to everything and anything. And I imagine your parents tried to instill that in you and your grandmother. But as a child, it's still hard when you are being treated as the other, even though you are capable of doing so much, right? So how did they help, and how did you help shape your mindset and continue to stay on a positive path where now you have this mission to inspire people all over the world through your story and your example?
I think it's kind of, if I were to split my life into like two segments, the first part of my life, the mindset search was more of like lived experience. And I think at a certain point, maybe around 2010, like I'd always listened to, like, in high school and stuff, my dad had given me like Tony Robbins books and stuff like that. And then started listening a lot to like where he had started, and like NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming. A guy named Richard Bandler, like he was one of the founders of NLP, like his kind of the main guy, like his name came up a lot. And so in 2010, I went to one of his seminars, and it was down in Orlando, Florida, and I fell in love with it. And I was just like, man, like, it was like a 2-week kind of like immersive like seminar, and just the people that it attracted were some of my favorite people that I'd ever been around. It was like, just, how it is. I mean, when you're on those like, like development type events, like people are just hungry for, learning and growth, and like anything that like relates to like, whether it's some advantage or edge it might give them in life in some way or some form, but they're generally just good people that are trying to figure out how to make themselves better. And so I think that's where I became obsessed with learning as much as I could about just the mind, how it worked. I mentioned wrestling, like, was one of my like main focuses, like through like high school and middle school and high school. And I was really, really bad when I started. I think that kind of like carried through like psychologically and like imprinted on me. Even in high school, when I became much better, I was beating a lot of like the top kids, in my weight class in the country, and doing things that I never would have dreamed that I was, possibly capable of doing before. And same thing in weightlifting. Like remember when I started lifting weights, I was lifting with like 5 pounds on each arm and like a tiny amount of weight. And like I looked at the other kids in my like high school weight room, and they're lifting like, there was a kid in there that was, doing a 250-pound bench press. And like, I was thinking, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to do that. And then, fast forward years later, and, I had a 420-pound like modified bench press, butterfly press, and, broke like world records in my weight class in weightlifting. And so, and then, it was like just one of those, like just those moments in time, like different things that would happen where I would kind of like look around, and there's such a surreal feeling. But I think deep down buried inside, there was also like still a tremendous amount of like the anxiety from, just that I'd always, dealt with. So I think that's what attracted me to like the mindset stuff more than anything, was just like how to develop like a sense of mastery around like understanding, how to get like a control of my mind, my emotions, and like, how to use that to the best of, my abilities to become an advantage. And it's amazing. I think that like, when you kind of learn that, and like different people have called it like different, things over the ages, but like people that had like somebody that like taught them that, at some point. So if, they would have, like, almost everybody that's ever achieved anything great, like had like those types of like, some type of teacher, some type of, mentor, some guide, somebody that like, opened their mind up to the fact that like it was a malleable, adaptable, pliable thing that you could use to like your advantage. And like that, like your mind, you weren't like being controlled by your mind, that like you were able to like dictate and direct, not everything certainly, but like, but so much. And just to change, your experience of whatever it is that's happening around you. You could be in the worst possible scenario and yet like be okay. Or, conversely, there's other people that like go through things, where they're, and what would be a blissful scenario for most people, but they're putting themselves through some type of hell, because they're just like, they're not, able to like get like a control of their mind. So yeah, I think it's that two parts. I think as a kid, it was just like a lived experience of like kind of going through the motions and having to kind of figure out how to like just deal with, the failure and like, the emotional side of whether it was a disability or whether it was like, athletics, down to like with everything, like the scariest moment in my high school career, I think was like asking my senior prom date out. We said yes, but like it was still like just like the nerves to go and like ask her on like the senior prom date. It was like I remember just being like terrified. I was but then again, then the second part of life, I think phase of life now, I've been kind of learning to go and understand and like look for the similarities and different things. It's like whether it's like I've been fascinated with the Zen side of things too, but then also too like. Whether it's like special forces and Navy SEALs, or entrepreneurs, different people like leaders over history and different points in time, like what is it that like people, knew and understood, to go and pull those kind of like little nuggets of like, wisdom from so. And it's great. I mean, that's what like one of the best parts I think of being alive and, this point in time too, like podcast and whatnot is like, there's so like, it's just an enormous wealth of information that's available to continually learn as much as we possibly can, that there's, and audiobooks, right? Like, I mean, like there's no limit to like the amount of information that we're able to go and consume. It's just, the trick is, I think, having them like, just dedicating like ourselves and our time to actually doing it.
I couldn't agree with you more. It can get overwhelming, but as long as you stay on a path, right? That's the important thing. Speaking of which, a lot of your path has been physical. You talked about wrestling. You talked about being a world record-setting weightlifter. We talked a little bit about your mountaineering. You're a CrossFit certified instructor, gym owner, champion wrestler, competitive mixed martial arts fighter. You've poured so much into the physical side and showing that you can do this, as well as being an author, being a speaker, sharing your inspiration with others in so many different ways. Not everybody who's been in your position or is in your position, right, with different abilities of many kinds would have taken up that mantle to say, I am going to work on inspiring other people. I know that I can do this because I've had to go through all of this to keep myself going, to keep myself inspired and motivated and in the right mindset to continue. What was that? Was there one moment in time or anything that you can share with us that prompted you to realize that you really had a story that you needed to share?
I mean, I think there are several moments where like, I had people a lot. So one of the both like difficult in a certain way but amazing, I think, things about like, sharing my story with like groups, afterwards, after like the events would be done, you'd have people come up and like share in private conversations and sometimes share some of the most outrageous stuff, and sometimes like really hard stuff that they had, gone through. And I remember I had a ex-girlfriend that you would travel with me to a lot of events, at one point in time in particular. And I remember like, seeing her just like break down and, cry after like a couple of events. And like, just because like people would go and do the same thing with her where they would just go and like kind of lay like, some really heavy stuff. It's almost kind of, I guess, being, it's like, think about like, I mean, the different people in different professions, like, it's certainly like speakers are not the, only ones that get this. I mean, even as a, like, like a gym trainer, you mentioned CrossFit and like, I realized that like being a fitness trainer was like as much, psychological, dealing with like people's issues than it was like, like the physical side of things. Like you have like hairdressers that are like the same thing, right? Like you may have certain people that like you're like drawn to that like, you can go and share something with that's like more, intimate. And but with this, like in particular, like, I would have like people that would come up and say some like really powerful stuff. But I kind of realized that like that was a huge part of the, the gift of, and so, there'd be days where I would kind of be in my own like victim mentality of like, sick of traveling, sick of like, flight delays and like, being on my own and like, all of that stuff. And then, then meet somebody in an event, that would go and say something to me, that puts it in perspective and say that it'd help them in some form or way. And I was like, wow, it just would kind of change things for me, like snap me out of like, that like mentality. So it's, not to say that I definitely have, those days too.
Yeah.
And like, I think ton of people do. And obviously the vast majority of the people that are listening to this are not in the same position. They're not motivational speakers that are not going to like, go and have people like, divulge their like, like full life and heartstrings, out in like a conversation. But yet, like, I think it's, to you though, I'd say like, I think it's just a matter of like how we show up. Like, do we make ourselves, available and approachable and like able to like have those conversations with people, or are we looking to like, try to run out the doors, do these things, kind of turn into that direction. So, there's
a level of empathy that you have to have though, because there are people who would be in your situation and not want to speak to those people or hear their stories. And the fact that you make them comfortable enough to come up and share their journeys with you, which sometimes
sure.
I'm sure is really stressful and doesn't necessarily feel as good. But the fact that people
I saw plenty of that too.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it was because you see all kinds, right? Like, I'd see speakers that I would see on stage that were like these amazing, like people, like you would tell a story that was like just really like heartfelt and emotional. And then like behind closed doors and backstage, they'd be an animal, not just like terrible people to be around, where it was just like, just like the sound of people or things like that. I was like, oh my God, like you're a really bad person. Like the impression that I had. And like, other times you meet people that are like the exact same, like who they are on stage is who they are off stage. But, it cracked me up. Like you see sometimes like this type of speakers, like more than once, like, kind of like out, on the tour, so to speak. And like, when you see them like cry in the exact same place on the stage at the exact same moment, like you realize it's like way more like theatrics than it is like actual, like, like speaking or presentation, which is, it's the same for anybody. It's like, when people go and hire me for an event, like the vast majority of the time, I mean, it's me delivering, 70, 80% is going to be, kind of based around my story. And, it's going to, be relatively similar, but yet at the same time, I try to make it as authentic as I possibly could, and try to make like something different where I remember hearing somebody told me once that like, you have to remember that like, the majority of the people that are hearing you, or them hearing you, it is like their first time, hearing something, and it kind of puts it like in a different perspective. And for other people that have, heard something multiple times, it's kind of like hearing something like, like going to a concert, listening to one of your favorite bands. Like you want to hear the songs that you've heard, multiple times,
And you might pick up something different, a little nugget that you didn't hear the first time. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what makes it a fun and unique business in a lot of ways, and like never really would have been something that I would have imagined doing. I think when I was a freshman at the University of Georgia, before I got to go and launch a book on Oprah that then turned into New York Times bestseller, like I went from being a college age kid to a full-time business traveler like overnight, and everything changed like so immediately. But I think I had no idea that I would have ended up doing what I was doing.
Yeah.
Just kind of happened.
I was going to ask you, what was it like that first time that you were invited to a stage and you had to share your story? Because if you haven't really been involved in that, yes, you've been involved in activities, sports where people are watching, but this is a whole other ballgame. It's you up on that stage, right? So what was that like?
I was, scared out of my mind for a lot of it, and like, but would just do it, I would, and I couldn't use a normal like lectern, right, or podium to like stand behind. I would have to just take a chair and sit, in the chair. So what I would do is initially, when I had no speaking experience, or how to like develop like a, kind of like an hour or so like speech, I would take a note card, and I just took a note card and like would write and like, underline words that I wanted to go and hit like a different kind of, that would remind me of the story, and so I just basically would take it and I would hide it underneath my leg and,
Ah.
I'd bring it on stage with me. And so I would just like, lift my leg up and like look down and like, see something. And, that would kind of trigger like whatever next thing that it was, that I was discussing. And when I first started, it was like, I was pretty much, just a wrestler. It was before any type of business experience, life experience, before, any of the mountaineering or, MMA or any of that stuff. Like it was just, like wrestling and football stories, but like, family stories and things like that. And yeah, I had no idea what I was doing. And so ironically, I remember one of the groups that I spoke for a ton and did a lot of events was for the subprime mortgage market right before the 2008 collapse. So from like 2005, 2006, mostly like 2006 to 2008, I was doing a ton of these like subprime mortgage events, like where they just had money like hand over fist, where they were like kind of like doing these events and all that, like kind of keep stuff, off the books, I think, or, whatever they were doing. And I had, was around all of this and had no idea, what was happening or occurring until, like later on, where it's just like, oh my gosh, like just wild. And just another one of those things where I found myself there, like, and just kind of happened to be.
Amazing. And then you kept learning and evolving and figuring out who you really wanted to share your message with and what else you wanted to do to expand your business. What does that look like today? Because we obviously went through a pandemic where there weren't as many live speaking events, but you have these other interests. So what's a day in the life of Kyle now?
So since like the pandemic, I mean, it's been ups and downs, and like it's always been very media dependent in terms of like, like keeping like a fairly like busy schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And I have always said too that I, wasn't sure that I'd be doing this forever. And, I'm not entirely sure. I'm kind of now like open and exploring, other options and seeing where things are going to, lead and take me. I've been doing this for some time, and I think I'm always going to have like an aspect of being kind of around speaking in some form or regard or capacity. I think it'll always be the case, but I'm not entirely sure what things are going to look like. I've had years that there was a lot of like big like major media that was done, whether it was like climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, like coming back home, and like the having like the stories that were done and shared on that then led to doing tons and tons of events. Where I remember, I think the year that we did Kilimanjaro, I think I traveled like 270 days out of that year or something like that, something insane. And so, sometimes, like just wildly super busy, and then other times, are not as much. And I've just kind of had to learn and, deal with and kind of adapt and flow with what things kind of like pop up and, opportunities are available. And I've kind of had that, business like ADD with stuff too. I think that's, so doing a lot of different things, right? Like opening up a CrossFit gym. One of my mentors, I remember he told me, he said, like, I just did it with the CrossFit gym and opened it because I was bored. And it's kind of, there's some truth to that. I think it's like, I've always enjoyed trying a lot of different things and kind of having exposure to, I think philosophically, that's been my thing is, specialize and not specializing, just like being able to be exposed to like a ton of different stuff. I know, you got like, obviously when you shared a bit of your schedule too. And like, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, you've got, so many different things that are going on, and yet like, you find a way to make it work.
Wow.
But at this now too, I think things being a bit slower recently has opened up, my eyes to so many things that like I, wasn't doing or aware of, just from like a even like enjoyment of life perspective. Back when I was so busy, and like, now I think just like on a, like a day to day, like just, enjoying like, waking up in the morning and be able to have a cup of coffee, like there's just a gratitude for that instead of feeling that frantic, need to like slam a 20-ounce, like, venti Starbucks just to like feel like I could function. It's a very different feeling.
Yeah, I can imagine. Are you thinking about doing another book that continues on what happened from the time of your first book to now?
I'm not sure. I think maybe I'd answer that with like at some point, possibly. but I'm not entirely sure. The book itself was so wild of like how it like kind of like came about and came to be in such a unique thing where the publisher just happened to see me on a Larry King interview. And I was 18 years old when I did it. I did an hour on Larry King and was, scared out of my mind doing it. But yet, like, he was amazing. Larry was awesome and was trying to help me get a vehicle adapted at the time and was like trying to like pumping people to my website like over and over and over again. So every commercial break, he was like, trying to send people to my website. Like, we got to get a car. It's like all that. And I got thousands of emails from people after the interview aired, and my parents were helping me go through them. I was in the LA studio at the time, and then I was going to New York and got invited to Bruce Weber. He was a photographer at Abercrombie.
Yeah.
And had done photographs for me and had done the cover for my book. But this was kind of even before that came about. Like, I was in New York to go and visit Bruce at one of his book debuts when I got the call from my parents where they're like, hey, 2 of the emails that came through were from a book publisher that wants to do your book, and he's going to be in New York. Do you want to go and meet him? And so I did the interview with Larry King in LA. Then I flew to New York to go to this book party. And the next morning I woke up and had breakfast, meeting with my book publisher. And we took the train down to DC, and, I was 18 years old and, came home with the book deal and literally was like, it was 6 months later, like finished it, the final edits, did a lot of the typing in my dorm room at Georgia, and it finished the edits, came out, launched it on Oprah. The night that it came out on Oprah, it was number 1 on Amazon, and it hit I think number 11 on the New York Times list. And so that is a 18, 19-year-old kid was just like such a crazy whirlwind.
For anybody at any age, it would be a whirlwind, I think.
Yeah.
So I can't even imagine being that age, and you're still between like being a teen, a young adult, and like actually launching yourself as a full adult.
Yeah. And I think like so much of life, I think just, kind of riding the wave and just trying to do my best to like handle it and kind of, figure it out. And, I think it, taught me so much, but most importantly, I mean, like in hindsight, like of all the different things that we've talked about, like, and all the things that have happened and occurred, like things that I never would have like dreamed or imagined that like would have like developed. I think so much of it is, like just kind of like following that, like the journey that like life can, unveil if we're willing to, to answer it, answer the call to kind of like, meet. And that's available for anybody in like any point in time. I think but it, can look different, and the different chapters of life can look very different. And, I think if I end up, taking a typical job as an account executive, like I would be thrilled, and happy just doing that. I think like, just the sense of normalcy after all of the, kind of wildness and, all that. Like, so I'm not entirely sure, where things are going to go and, what things are going to, manifest. But I think it's kind of the same of just like, accepting, and kind of like flowing with it as opposed to like, that rigidity and fighting against it, I guess.
100%. Well, and that's actually a perfect tee up for my next question, which is we're obviously going to have people go to your website, kyle-maynard.com, so they can learn more about you, your books, your speaking engagements, book you for speaking, other stuff like that. But I did notice on your LinkedIn that you are open to more typical jobs as well. So what in an ideal world would you like to do? Because there are a lot of small businesses, entrepreneurs, and corporate, bigwigs who are listening right now who may be able to or may want to call you up and say, hey, I have a job for you.
That would be amazing. Yeah, I'm grateful for anything that comes my way in terms of, like whatever might be interesting. You kind of throughout the last little bit, heard, I've gotten involved in a lot of different random stuff. But my mentality is, I've kind of always found a way to figure out how to do whatever it is that I'm doing and apply myself to that. And I think the benefit too with a lot of like remote work and stuff like that is there's a lot of different opportunities that could go and come up, and whether something to part-time, full-time, a combination of things, I'm kind of going to be just seeking out, and looking to, fill my schedule, a bit more with just for my own sanity too, in a lot of ways, I think for the next year. And like my sister has been one of my inspirations lately too. And like, she works her butt off, but she's done really well for herself. And like, like she's an account executive for a recruiting company, and haven't set up anything official with them yet, but it's one of the companies I want to like talk to and like,
Right.
think about doing some work with. But I think it's cool to see, how she's created her life, and like she works really hard for the time that she, clocks in to clocks out. But like, when she does, clock in and clock out, she's there at work when she's there at work. And when she's not, she's able to like, be there with her husband. She got a new baby, and like, she's just, a good sister, a good mom. It's like, it's fun to watch, and see what she's done. Yeah. And super proud of her for doing that. My other two sisters are teachers and have, even that too, I thought about like, teaching or coaching or something along those lines. But, maybe that would be something I end up doing down the road. I think there's, some other schooling aspects of things like that would have to happen and occur. But I've had, people that have impacted my life, so much from those communities too. I think that could be a possibility. But, it's just seeing what they have to go and deal with though, like, in terms of the nonsense side of things. Like it's wild. So yeah, again, I'm not entirely sure where things are going to go with it, but I think that like I would want to go and, say it's an account executive role or something along those lines. I could go and take, and apply whatever mindset it is that, to try to help the entire, whatever it is that I'm working on, or the entire organization as a whole, bit of both.
Yeah. Amazing. You're hearing it here. Kyle, who's done so many different things, but you've had such a whirlwind life. You're ready to settle down a little bit, settle into something where you're making meaningful impact for an organization, using your mindset and all the skills with people that you've developed or had to develop in all of your other pursuits. So, we'll have to have a follow-up to see, when you do choose what you're going to do next, or in addition to speaking and all the other things. And I'd love to bring you back on and talk about that and what your journey looks like at that
That'd be
point.
awesome. Yeah, I think it's something as a final closing kind of thought with everybody. Like one lesson that I always try to like get across in a speech just came to mind, and I thought about it because of something when you were just saying right now, like kind of describing things. I didn't know if that was going to come up or not, or I haven't really talked about next steps publicly yet. But one of my speaking mentors, he said to me, he said, speakers speak about the message that they most need to hear. And, I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? Like, you think about what leads somebody to go and speak about something, in some topic. It's because they've had to like have some sort of experience in their life that has, led them to deal with and confront whatever it is that they're dealing with. So, for me, when things get like really tough, especially like in a mountain climb, for instance, so the two biggest climbs that I've done, so Kilimanjaro in Africa, the highest peak in Africa, and Aconcagua, the highest peak in South America. The both climbs, took everything. Kilimanjaro was, I think, around the mountain for about 12 days. Aconcagua in South America, that was 17 days, and it goes up to 22,800 feet. So it's the highest peak in the world outside of the Himalaya. And when we summited, there was like 10 of us on the summit, and it was outside of the climbing season of the Himalaya. So we were probably the 10 highest people in the world. And one of my favorite random bucket list achievements was I hadn't gone to the bathroom all day. And so I had to like strip down and like go to the bathroom, like on the summit. And like, at one point I was probably the highest naked person on planet Earth, which is like, I never would have imagined that would have been the case. But it was looking around and seeing like, where we were, it was just breathtakingly beautiful. It was amazing, and never could have fathomed that I would have gotten there. It was just, there's so much of the experience that like, I'll never forget. But battling the doubt the whole way up was especially difficult. And I remember thinking that there was no way that I was going to make it. There's no way that I was going to succeed. Like all this, like the fear, the doubt, like all this stuff that was coming to my head, and like thinking like just physically, like I wasn't going to be able to go and do it. But I made a realization and kind of almost, Zen-like realization, if you think about it, was like, I realized that none of those like thoughts, none of those concerns matter. What matters is, I think when you want to like find out if you're capable of doing something, is just giving your best is the only thing that genuinely, truly matters. And what I kind of did was like, so when I'm hiking, I'm down on all fours, like in a bear crawl kind of position, right? And I've got special custom shoes that go over my arms and over my legs, but I'm down on all fours, bear crawling. And, so I'm just looking down at the dirt, the rock, and the ice. And it's that for, the several weeks that I'm, there in the mountain. And I remember in this moment in time, like thinking like, and a day where I had to go and do twice as much as I had done previously, like had all of these like, fears and doubts and, concerns coming up. And my guide that told me if I didn't make it in a certain amount of time, then I wasn't going to be allowed to hit the summit. I wasn't going to be allowed to continue to go on. So like I knew I had to give everything that I could. But what I did was I just turned it into a game. And my ski goggles kind of like created like a 3-foot like outline of, just visibility. And so I pretended I was like, that's the only 3 feet in the world that exists. And I just have to deal with that 3 feet. That's it. I don't have to figure out the rest, the trip. I just have to deal with that 3 feet. And then, I deal with that 3 feet, and then there's going to be another 3 feet to go on up here. I deal with that 3 feet. And I deal with that, sequentially, just, 3 feet at a time. And when I did that, any thought that would come into my head that wasn't pertaining to those like 3 feet that were directly in front of me, I would just try to push out, and it worked. And I was like, just like even the thought of like, how long have I been going? And like all that stuff, like it didn't matter. And like, I just focused on that like 3 feet that was directly in front of me. And, again, would do that 3 feet and then another 3 feet, another 3 feet. And I remember on the summit day when I was doing this, not knowing if I was going to like actually make the time cutoff before, get turned back around. My guide, grabbed my waist belt and told me to like stop and look up where he was. And it was around 4:00 on our summit day. And 15 minutes later, 4:15, I was like rounding the corner to like, to hit the summit, and be at the highest point in the world outside of the Himalaya. It was absolutely incredible and amazing. But I think just as a consequence too of realizing that like, any thought that comes in your head, whether it's a good thought or bad thought or whatever, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're there in that moment, like looking at that 3 feet that's in front of you, wherever you are in your life, whatever it is that you're dealing with. And that's the only 3 feet in the world that exists, the only 3 feet in the world that matters. Everything else can, fade away.
Amazing. Well, you are truly an inspiration, and I've enjoyed this conversation so much. And I know there are many more to come. Now that we finally got it together and we're able to find a time where we could have this conversation. So Kyle Maynard, thank you for bringing your inspiration, your message of no excuses to us today on Your Brand Amplified.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Of
course. And thanks to everybody who's watching this episode or listening to it on your favorite platform. Don't forget to check out Kyle's book on Amazon. I will say I haven't gotten it yet, but I have the link up so that I can get it when we get off. And I hope that this is serving for a lot of inspiration for all of you to look at what you're doing in this new year, 2025, how you're going to stop making excuses and do what you really want, get what you really want to achieve, and be happy with who you are. Thanks for listening or watching to this episode of Your Brand Amplified. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you want to learn more, check us out at yourbrandamplified.com.